All right, we're going to welcome you all to come in and take a seat and bring your conversations. I'd like to introduce to you all Dick Hamley, who is the docent and historian at Pohick Church, and he is going to bring together some of the findings that we had from the ground penetrating radar project, together with, of course, the fact that Cranford and Pohick are so uniquely tied with our locations. And Dick is going to give us some frame of reference of everything there, and of course invite you to come visit Pohick to explore not just the old location but the new location as well.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. We really appreciate all of the work that's been done on our previous church, and we share a lot of really interesting history, and I'd like to just go through that history. I'd like to start, skip the period when this was Northumberland and the period when it was Westmoreland County, and go right to when 1664, when it became Stafford County. Because in 1667, the newly formed Stafford County Court came out with a court order which established the first three churches that we know of, that I know of. One of them became the Quantico Church, the other was Potomac Church, and the other one Aquia Church. Now, those didn't help us because those are all down near Aquia or even further south, and they were too far for congregation up here to go to. So the court order was amended in October of that year to require the wardens to arrange for a place of worship up here. And so that's the first church that I can find any information on. We don't know where it was. It was probably a rental structure. But we do know in 1715 there was a chapel over in Woodlawn, and the description is near the mouth of Piney Branch. So that's where Piney Branch dumps into Doe Creek, which is over near Woodlawn Village, near the corner of Pole Road and Jeff Todd Way. And that was located on land called the Chapel Lands, owned by George Mason II. That was replaced before 1729 by the Occoquan Church, which was another chapel. Now these are chapels. The parish church was the Potomac Church, and this was Overwharton Parish. In 1680, Overwharton Parish was formed, and these are all chapels within Overwharton Parish and run by the Overwharton Parish Vestry. Now the parish church for our area was the Potomac Church. That was 9 miles south of Aquia. So very few people probably ever got there. So these were chapels, and the way that worked was you have one vestry and one rector for the parish, not for every church. So there was no such thing as the vestry of Pohick Church or the vestry of the Occoquan Church. It was the vestry of the parish, and there was probably 3 or 4 churches, and the rector was required to get on his horse and go preach at the other churches once a month or something like that. So in those days, our parish church was the Potomac Church, although we really didn't have anything to do with it. And then, so by 1729, the church at Piney Branch was replaced by the Occoquan Church, which was located on the shore of Colchester on the Occoquan River near the ferry landing, and there are quite a few references locating it there. In 1730, Hamilton Parish was created, and also right after that, Prince William County was created utilizing the boundaries of Hamilton Parish, and the parish church was the Occoquan Church. Now, right after that, 1732, that parish was divided, and everything above the Occoquan River became Truro Parish. And we have the minutes of the vestry of Truro Parish, and we know that the Occoquan Church was also became the parish church of Truro Parish. But its location had changed. In 1732, it was located right here. In 1730, it was located down by the ferry landing. So Edith Sprouse, who wrote the book on Colchester, seemed to have the answer to that in her notes, that they must have either moved that church, like they moved Lewis Chapel, or rebuilt the church here. In 1733, that church was renamed Pohick Church. So 1735, we see, because we have the vestry minutes, we see Augustine Washington showing up on the vestry, George Washington's father. I should mention that the very first vestryman of the very first Pohick Church was Dennis McCarty, who built Mount Ayr Plantation, which is right up Telegraph Road. So 1735, Augustine Washington shows up. Then 1749, George Mason. And then in the 1750s, William Fairfax, and then George William Fairfax. 1762, George Washington shows up on the vestry of this church. The first thing they already had a church. I mean, the movement of the church, or the rebuilding of the church, was obviously done by the Hamilton Parish vestry and does not appear in the Truro Parish vestry. So it was obviously already done by the time the church was. This became Truro Parish. So the first thing they did was not build a new parish church for Truro Parish vestry. The first thing they did was start building new churches. The first one they built was the first Falls Church. And the other thing they did was they started building a glebe. Now, a glebe was required by law. That was a farm and a rectory for the rector of the church, a place for him to live and grow food, and the vestry was required to build one. Well, where was that? Well, for this church in those days, first of all, the rector was Charles Green, and he lived at Green Hill Plantation, which was located on Backlick Road, close to where Terminal Road ties into Backlick Road now. That's where the plantation house was. The first glebe built for him was in that area somewhere. But then when you split a parish, the law also required that the original parish church sell their silver and their glebe and split the money with the new parish and the old parish in proportion to the tithables, number of tithables in each. So when the Occoquan Church became, they formed Hamilton Parish, and the Occoquan Church became the parish church for Hamilton Parish, it got a shot of money from the Potomac Church down near Aquia. So that was probably spent on moving the church or rebuilding it up here. And similarly, when in 1732, Truro Parish was formed, and then 1742, Fairfax County was formed utilizing the boundaries of Truro Parish. But then in 1748, about the time they just got the glebe built for Charles Green, they split Truro Parish and made the western part Cameron Parish. And then later in the 1750s, they made Loudoun County based on the boundaries of Cameron Parish. But when they did that, they made Truro Parish was required to sell its silver and its glebe that they had just built for Charles Green and divide the proceeds with the Cameron Parish. So they did that. So that meant they had to start building another parish, another glebe. So they did. And the property for the second Pohick Church glebe was originally owned by Charles Green. So they purchased land from Charles Green to build a glebe for Charles Green. And it was along the Newington Road, just north of there. It was located somewhere between Lavelle Tupel Park and where Ockatink Road ends at Newington Road. Somewhere along in there was the second parish house. And it was, we also know that the first parish, glebe, the first glebe, we know that the first glebe can't have been far away because the deed said that they were adjoining. So the new glebe was adjoining the old glebe property. Now, the new glebe was the graveyard. New glebe eventually got sold when they, when they split Truro Parish the second time to create Fairfax Parish, and then Christ Church became the parish church for Fairfax Parish. That required, once again, Truro Parish to sell the silver and the glebe. And so that glebe, at that time, the one on just north of Newington Road, was purchased by the McCarty family, since they already owned all the other property around there, and Mount Ayr and so forth. And Daniel McCarty, the son of Dennis McCarty, purchased it. And the nice thing about that story is he gifted the silver back to Pohick Church, and then he lived on, so he ended up owning what was the old glebe house. And that, during his tenure owning it, it became known as Newington. The second glebe of Pohick Church became known as Newington. That's where the Newington area got its name. So, and that's not far from Green Hill. So, all of these for the Pohick Church that was here. Now, in 1767, this church was getting very old. Even if it was built new, it was still getting, if it was the original church, it was really old. But anyway, it was deemed non-repairable, and so they decided to build a new Pohick church. So as was mentioned before, the argument came up about where are we going to build it. And it was mentioned that Pohick Creek had no bridge in those days and was a serious ford, and half the time you couldn't get across it at all, and even nowadays it floods. So the people down here, headed by George Mason, argued that, and with George Washington, that the new Pohick Church should be built where all of our ancestors are buried, and also on our side of the creek. And George Washington, who recommended a place up there which was more central, said, no, the new church needs to be more convenient to all the plantations and also on my side of the creek. So and they had that discussion went on, and that showed George Washington that he was up against a very good speaker, and he was not a particularly good speaker, but he was good in math. So he surveyed the entire area before the final meeting on this subject. He surveyed the area, and he drew the famous 1767 map. And then he measured on the map the distances to both points from all the plantation houses and came to the meaning on arm for bear. And he was able to present a mathematical, a technical, compelling argument that yes, indeed, that was in fact more convenient and closer on the average to all the plantation houses. So his argument carried the day. That's how the Pohick Church got located up there. Now, that particular location at that time, there was almost nobody living around it that could hear a bell. So they decided to save the money and not add a bell tower. That's why it doesn't look like a church. And it's interesting that Aquia Church, 20 years earlier, had been built and burned down immediately and built again. And so they ran out of money, and the steeple, they were going to rebuild the steeple, but it got a certain height and they gave up on it. And so now they made the same argument. Now Aquia Church has a really short steeple. So they decided that we're going to build Pohick Church, the new Pohick Church, where it is. And so they ran RFP in the Virginia and Maryland Gazettes, and the response was from, we got a good response from Daniel French, who owned the property. That was the old Norman Cell Grant, and at that time of the, in 1769, when that he was hired to build the church, that was one of his tobacco farms. So, they formed a building committee. George Washington was on it, and a lot of other familiar names. So they started building the church. Daniel French started building the church. The walls, they had the big brick kiln, got the walls up. 1771, he died. Now, of course, this is Church of England, right? This is a government church, a big, expensive church. When you're going to build something like that, you're required to have a cosigner, a security, somebody who's a pillar of the community who can be counted upon to check on the builder, the contractor, to make sure it's built per spec and that he doesn't run off with materials and so forth. That cosigner was George Mason himself. So Daniel French died. George Mason became the contractor that finished Pohick Church. But more than that, when Daniel French died, they did probate, right? So they did an inventory and appraisal of his estate. And that included several different farms. One of the inventory sites was the building site for the new church. So all of his property was listed, including the names of all the enslaved workers, their skills, and by description, their ages and everything. And even down to an infant named Humphrey, and also one indentured bricklayer. So we know 27 of the people who built Pohick Church by name, who did the heavy lifting in any way. And we know they were not the only slaves. There was other labor contracted for. But that's a rare opportunity we found to give credit to some of the people who built the church. So we have all their names on a plaque. But more than that, that's just part of probate. Probate also has the accounting, in which you normally just pay the debts of the estate, collect money, do the estate, and deal with the heirs. That's not what happened in this case, because the will of Daniel French says that if anything happens to me, I wish that the money due me to build Pohick Church would continue to go to my estate, and that you use my estate to finish Pohick Church. Therefore, the accounting of the probate doesn't stop. It goes on. It does what accounting does. It pays debts, and it lists everything that the money was spent on, and it lists money coming in from sale of tobacco and from the vestry to build the church. And it goes on, and there are hundreds of entries. And so we know all kinds of details about building Pohick Church. It's interesting that, for example, the second entry in the accounting, we know who the cook was, Mary Wilson. We know who chopped the wood, a slave named Peter. We know so much. The second entry in the accounting was the purchase of the shingles. Who do you think bought the shingles for Pohick Church? George Washington. Now, if I just told you that on the street, you'd say, "Oh, come on," George Washington bought the shingles. But there's more detail than that. It's just amazing. The next entry shows a payment, a reimbursement to the guy who was hired, a guy named Maloney, to go pick up the shingles. And when he arrived, now in parallel, I should go step back a minute, in parallel with the accounting of the estate, you also have the vestry minutes. They're also in accounting. They also list money coming into the vestry and also list what the vestry is paying for. And so we notice that when this starts, for example, the vestry hired a clerk for the building site in addition to the clerk for Pohick Church. So what does he do? He probably inventories materials. And so you can see he probably did, because when Maloney came back with the shingles, he didn't have 32,000 shingles. He had 1,000 or so less. And did that get caught? Yeah, the clerk caught it. Now, did he have to pay it back? Yes, he did. The next entry said Mr. Maloney required to reimburse the estate for missing shingles. He was building a chicken coop on the side or something. So it's just amazing the detail that we know about Pohick Church, and we are so indebted to Fairfax County circuit court for taking care of these documents for 250 years. They've been sitting there, and they're still there today. Okay, I should go on, and so the building goes on. I can come back to that. So the construction goes on. 1772, they run out of money, so they have to do some innovative fundraising. So they sold pews. Now that's not uncommon. Everything from the crossing toward the pulpit got sold, except for a few that were reserved for special purposes, like visitors and the vestry and the rector's family and so forth. So who bought the pews? Well, we know who bought all the pews, but one thing's interesting there is that when you bought a pew, you received a deed just like if you bought a farm or a house. And those deeds are recorded in the courthouse just like if you bought a house. And guess what? Some of them are still sitting there today after 250 years. We just had our fair where the circuit court brought a pew deed. This time was for the Harrison Manley pew, which is where I sit usually. And so there's the Harrison Manley pew, and there's a circuit court with the deed for it, the original deed. And they also brought the accounting for Daniel French's probate, and there it was. And they had it open to the page with George Washington paid for the shingles. So this is just, we live in an area where we're blessed with amazing record keeping. So anyway, so they sold all those pews, and I can tell you who bought them all. George Mason bought 2. Alexander Henderson bought 2. He was the father of Archibald Henderson, the first commandant of the Marine Corps. George William Fairfax bought one up front. Of course, he's the son of William Fairfax, who built Belvoir. And George Washington bought one, and then his cousin Lund Washington bought another one. But he never paid for it, so George Washington ended up paying for it, and so George Washington owned 2. And then Daniel McCarty bought one, and then the other people, the Triplet family bought one, Martin Cockburn bought one, Harrison Manley. And how much did they pay? Well, it was an auction, so the prices weren't set. Some of them went for 16 pounds Virginia money, some of them for only 12 pounds Virginia money, in that range. That's how much they sold for. So, we continued on building the church. Church was finished in 1774, but there was another contract. After the church was finished, a contract for making a baptismal font. And they hired William Copine. We know both from the vestry minutes and from this accounting that the stonemason was William Copine. He also worked on a quiet church. He was one of the stonemasons on a quiet church 20 years earlier. So he was contracted to make a font, a baptismal font, which now sits in the back of the church, where the font ought to be, according to the vestry minutes. Now, I should mention that the church was built with drawings, but they were actually the drawings for Falls Church. And the drawings didn't have any detail. All the door heads, the pulpit, the fonts, all that stuff was, even the thickness of the wall, size of the bricks, all that stuff was specified in the minutes, not the drawings. So you could use the drawings for another building, even though Pohick Church is much bigger, 15 feet bigger than Falls Church, and has 2 doors in the back and 1 window, whereas Falls Church has 2 windows and 1 door. All that was laid out in the minutes. Likewise with the font. The font is specified in the minutes as, 6 pounds sterling to make a font, a baptismal font, per plat number 150 in Langley's design book. Another example of the paperwork still laying around. So I went down to Gunston Hall, because George Mason was the contractor at that point, and sure enough, Langley's design book still sitting in Gunston Hall after 250 years, and there was plat 150 showing our font. Very interesting. So we're blessed with all of this research material. But if you've been in Pohick Church, you notice that sitting in the middle of the church is another font. What's that doing there? It's a great big ugly font. And that font was actually discovered or pointed out to the diocesan historian in 1890 when somebody, one of the parishioners noticed it in a pig farm nearby, and he identified it as the font made for that church in 1773, 1774. And that was wrong, but he didn't know because the Copine font had been missing since the Civil War. So he knew about there should have been a font, and he thought that was the one, but it wasn't. So we have sent our rector to University of Oxford, Department of Archaeology, with photographs and stone samples to find out about that font, and they sent us a report. And it says that font is late Saxon, early Norman, so it's 1,000 years old. But I'm sorry, it's not a font. It's actually a mortar vessel. Looks like a font. It's a mortar vessel out of a monastery kitchen. Well, what's it doing in Pohick Church? Well, it explains that after the Reformation, 1534, Henry VIII closed all the monasteries, right? So the Church of England ends up with all the secondhand junk. And there's an arm of the Church of England called the Society for the Propagation of Gospel in Foreign Parts, which is responsible for supporting missions. I think it still is today. So they inherited all this stuff and handed it out to missions all over the world. So it probably got given to the previous Pohick Church. So that we consider that ancient font as the only relic we have of the previous Pohick Church. Even though for 100 years we've been baptizing babies in a medieval food processor. But we love it. So, so the church is finished and in 1774. But what's going on then? Well, if Fairfax resolves, people are starting to think about the future. You have 1775. You have Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, and the British are starting to lose control of the Church of England, all the churches here, 250 churches. And so what became of it? And then 1776, we've got Declaration of Independence, but also George Mason's Declaration of Rights. 1777, we got Thomas Jefferson's draft legislation, including, separation of church and state and all that stuff. So people are really talking, and the British are like out of the picture. So what became of all these colonial churches? What was Pohick Church? Who owned it? Ownership of the colonial churches in Virginia fell to the General Assembly. Still a government church, but it fell to the General Assembly. And so for the next 10 years, until freedom of religion, it was essentially a state church. But they were looking ahead, right? They were, during that 10 years, between 1776 and 1786, they were farming, like the secular work that the vestry did was getting farmed out to Fairfax County, to the Committee of the Overseers of the Poor, which was their version of what of the social services that the vestry did. The vestry did a lot of secular work. I know in 1751, the budget for the Truro Parish Vestry was twice the budget of the Fairfax County government. So all that stuff was getting farmed out back to Fairfax County. And the other thing that was happening was all of these denominations were sending in petitions and proposals and draft legislation, and the in baskets of the General Assembly were filling up, and they were working hard to draft legislation to send it out for comment, and that exchange and dithering went on for 10 years. Finally, all of the some very interesting proposals by the various denominations, and that kind of separated into two groups. One group felt that we agree that the church is generally beneficial to society, so society ought to be willing to pay for it. Then, by the way, George Washington was in that group. And then the other group, headed by Madison, which argued that no, we've got to stop paying for all this religion, separation of church and state completely. et cetera, et cetera. So those two groups were arguing and submitting proposed legislation. One piece of legislation that was proposed by the newly formed Protestant Episcopal Church of Virginia. They proposed that let's just unite all these churches, incorporate all these churches as the Protestant Episcopal Church of Virginia, and that will preserve the religion, because there was a lot of concern, big concern, that if you did just, these were all government buildings, right? If you just made them into storehouses or something and got rid of the churches, if you didn't have a government church, they were afraid you would lose moral compass, that society would lose the moral compass, and people love their churches, they really did. So that looked like a pretty good solution, even though they still hadn't solved who pays for it. So that's what happened to these churches. They became Protestant Episcopal Church of Virginia, except for a few that were privately owned, like the one in Irvington and Westover and churches like that, were built by private funds, owned privately. Finally in 1786, the General Assembly assigned the version of the proposed legislation with freedom of religion and separation of church and state. And finally it was done. So from that point on, we had to start passing the plate. I mean, before that, these government churches, right, they just taxed you. Every harvest time, you had to pay a levy, which was getting pretty onerous. So people were happy to get rid of that. So that's what happened, and that's how it happened. Any questions?
That's very cool. Thank you.
I read an archaeological article recently about the fact that for about 300 years, all the mortars that were used in England were made of Purbeck marble from the island of Purbeck on the southwest coast of England. They found a rack full of mortars being shipped to another part of England. And of course, a lot of them went to monasteries, things like that. It would be interesting to know
well, I had a lot of fun doing it. So, and actually, when you were talking about the glebe, after I had spoken to you when we started this process, I found out that that second glebe is literally across the street from my house. And there is a graveyard there that I don't know who's buried there, but it made me wonder whether it's people from the glebe that are buried in that. It's sort of stuck at the back of houses that are built. The Veltepel Park is this kids' park that was, the Veltepel was a lady who lived in that development across the street from me, didn't die until she was in her 90s. Was out picking up trash with the things until she was in her 90s. Reminds me of you, she was out there. And I didn't know about it, but I knew about the graveyard back there because my kids had friends over there, and they told me about it, and it's something spooky, let's go out and do Halloween over there, right? So I would get to go out and find my way through all these houses and say, I'm just coming to look at the graveyard. And I'm just going to try and see if I can get back there and see if there's any names that might tie back to the second glebe. But yeah, fascinating.
If you're talking about the old graveyard where Pohick Road, it's Newington Road, and then across the street is the graveyard.
Yes.
That's the graveyard for Newington. So it has McCarty and the people they married into.
Doesn't have anything with the glebe. But it's where the glebe was, because that's where he out.
That's where that is the graveyard for Newington. That's why I said the glebes were somewhere between there and the Veltepel Park.
Gotcha. And Mount Ayr is literally from that spot. If you take Newington Road out to where it crosses Telegraph and cross over, Mount Ayr is like there, and that's where McCarthy's. The ruins are still there of Mount Ayr Mansion. And I've seen pictures that the soldiers in World War I, maybe when Fort Belvoir started, they actually camped in the grounds of Mount Ayr back there. So it's rich area for history. It's just amazing.
Yeah, there's so much that needs to be an archaeological dig.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to get my friend Mark to. We're going to go out with our GPR and go rent and find stuff.
We're so fortunate to have Fairfax County that's as conscious as they are. For example, when they were going to develop down here, they stopped the development and said, okay, no, it needs to be Old Colchester Park and Preserve because we have a rare opportunity here. We have a colonial town that died because, it got bypassed. But there's no city built on top of it.
Right.
So it's a rare opportunity to study it. And I think that's really responsible.
Yeah. The only building I think is still down there is the Fairfax Inn. That is still the only remaining building, I believe, from Old Colchester. That was said so. But yeah, get out and about and go visit. And please go enjoy the grounds and
Well,
everything.
if anybody has any questions, let me know. She has my email.
Yes. And we're going to keep our relationship going.
Yes, sure.
We're so tight together here, so it's wonderful. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you, Dick, very much. I appreciate it.